My paper is drawing from a larger work. My dissertation examined women's activism in 3 cities, in Denver, in Indianapolis, and in Durham, from 1960 to 1975. And I'm going to be speaking today about the Denver piece, but if you have questions later on and want to talk to me about Durham or Indianapolis, I'm happy to do that also. And the title of the paper is What Necessity Breeds: Feminist Networks in Colorado, 1967 to 1979. In the early 1970s, feminism seemed to be everywhere in Colorado. Feminist issues met with a great deal of success in the halls of the Colorado State Legislature. For example, the state liberalized its abortion laws in 1967, making abortion legal in cases of rape, incest, or severe fetal defect, even if the woman's life was not in danger. The state ratified the federal ERA in 1973 and also passed a state equal rights amendment that same year. The Colorado Commission on the Status of Women, or the CCSW as I'll refer to it, sponsored workshops on women's issues and provided child care at the Capitol for women who came to speak with their legislators or had other business with the state government. The CCSW also oversaw a series of state-funded women's centers in each of the major cities along the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains. Each center had a high degree of autonomy, able to craft the programs most helpful to and in demand by the women of their city. For instance, the Denver Center, which opened in the fall of 1973, focused primarily on employment, providing a talent bank to employers and a, quote, resource library to women seeking jobs. All of this action was undertaken with a Republican occupying the governor's mansion, a Republican who, in many cases, urged these programs and bills along. And my talk's going to explore both the possibilities and the limitations feminist activists faced in a climate that was so hospitable to many of their aims. Throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s, women's groups such as Denver's Now chapter and the local YWCA were quite successful in advancing their agendas to improve women's lives. However, because so much of the activism of these groups, especially as I'll discuss Denver Now, flowed through the State House, a vibrant local network of feminists independent from the government did not emerge as thoroughly as in the other cities I examined. Instead, women's groups worked together under the auspices of the State Commission on the Status of Women. The CCSW was the network for feminist action in Denver and throughout the state, and was dependent on bipartisan political support of its positions in order to survive. This lack of independent connections among women's groups became increasingly problematic as the 1970s progressed, as feminism became more and more strongly identified with the Democratic Party, and as conservative activists began to attack many of feminism's gains in Colorado. Feminists in Denver, along a bipartisan government-centered community, had difficulty coming together to create a sustained challenge to their conservative opponents. And by the end of the 1970s, feminists found themselves on the losing side of several key battles. The high rate of success for feminist issues and by female lobbyists and activists in the Colorado legislature was due partially to the state's quite unusual history with regard to female office holding. Women gained the vote in Colorado in 1893 and began running for office immediately. There has been at least one woman in the Colorado state legislature every year since the mid-1930s. The presence of women in the halls of the Colorado legislature was therefore well established before the emergence of the national women's movement in the late 1960s. Now, working alongside female legislators did not necessarily make Colorado's male legislators more acquiescent to the demands of feminists than their counterparts elsewhere, nor were female legislators automatic feminists. But an acceptance of female office holding gave Colorado feminists an advantage over their counterparts elsewhere in the country. Activists in other states who wanted to use legislation to bring about feminist change had to first establish relationships within the state legislature and undergo other forms of what one historian has termed, quote, political socialization before they could pursue their agenda. This socialization process was often long and painful for women in other states. One ERA activist in North Carolina noted simply that, quote, we just didn't realize it was going to be that difficult, close quote, to build the political connections necessary for success. In Colorado, many women and many women's organizations were already familiar with the workings of the state government, and officials in state government were accustomed to their presence in the State House. Feminists could therefore proceed straight to lobbying for a specific bill or program without having to first learn the basics of political action or persuade legislators of the legitimacy of their presence. Female legislators standing in both political parties also affected the legislative climate that feminist activists encountered in the late 60s and early 70s. Until the election in 1974, women serving in the Colorado legislature served the two major parties in nearly equal numbers, with Republicans often holding a slight edge. Issues that became closely linked with the women's movement, such as abortion, found support among men and women in both parties in Colorado. This bipartisan support of legislation and programs benefiting women made it more difficult for feminism's detractors to tar all Colorado feminists with the brush of sort of liberal radicalism once the national women's movement emerged. By contrast, portrayals of feminists as radical women, out of touch with the mainstream opinion of their state, created hurdles for feminists in states like North Carolina and Indiana when they needed legislation to achieve feminist goals. Bipartisan support of feminism was not unique to Colorado. Historian Catherine Rimpf has documented the support for a lot of these programs, especially the ERA, within the sort of upper echelons of the Republican Party in the 60s and early 70s. And my research shows that Republican feminists existed among the party's rank and file as well. Throughout the 1960s, the government of Colorado addressed issues that became part of the women's movement by the end of the decade. In 1964, Governor John Love convened the Colorado Commission on the Status of Women. And state commissions on the status of women arose in every state in the mid-60s in response to President Kennedy's Presidential Commission on the Status of Women. But in most cases, they were sort of a one-time thing. The commission met, it issued its report, and in many cases disbanded. The Colorado Commission met continuously and consistently expanded its scope for the next 15 years. Commission Chairwoman Blanche Cowperthwaite helped ensure the commission's perpetuation by persuading the state to make it a statutory agency in 1972. That same year, the commission also opened the first of 7 women's resource centers, and as I mentioned, each major city in the state had a center by 1975. And the purpose of these centers was to, quote, advance the welfare, status, progress, and best interests of women throughout Colorado. The Commission on the Status of Women provided a space in state government for women's concerns to be given voice and a central location for advocating changes in legislation and government services well into the 1970s. Chairwoman Cowperthwaite really embodied the connections that enabled feminist action through legislation to flourish in Denver. She had served in the legislature herself earlier in the 1950s. She was the head of a committee established by the executive branch, and she was connected to numerous women's organizations in Denver. And Cowperthwaite was not the only woman on the CCSW to have these kinds of connections. Many members of Denver Now and the Colorado Women's Political Caucus also served on the CCSW, on the State Commission on the Status of Women. And they all communicated with women in other organizations, keeping groups without members on the commission informed of what the commission was doing. In Colorado, the state government proved to be attentive to women's concerns and issues before there was a national movement urging them to be so. And the state government's predisposition to work on issues that affected women, even in the absence of grassroots education or agitation for such work, had a tremendous impact on the shape of feminism in Denver in the 1970s. But even with such a responsive state government, many of Denver's largest women's organizations also undertook feminist action in the 1970s. The YWCA was one such group. In 1970, the national YW voted to make one of the organization's goals to, quote, revolutionize society's expectations of women. Denver YW leaders saw their organization as an important site of feminist work in Denver. The group publicly supported further liberalization of the state's abortion laws and was one of the sponsors of the first feminist conference for Mexican-American women, which was held at the Houston YWCA in 1971. The chapter even paid travel expenses for several of its Mexican-American members to go to that conference. The YWCA had been a leader in organizing women's community work in Denver for decades, and then in the early 70s, a new group came to town with the founding of Denver Metro Now in the fall of 1970. While many chapters of Now were becoming more diverse as the organization spread throughout the country early in the 1970s, the Denver chapter hewed very closely to Now's early constituency of highly educated middle-class women.